So just before we get started, I'll make a quick announcement about the satsangs going forward. So this week will be the last week where there are 5 satsangs a week. Starting next Monday, I will do 2 satsangs a week on a Wednesday night and Saturday night. Well, Wednesday night and Saturday night for me. It's probably Wednesday morning and Saturday morning for you guys. Same time as currently, but on a Wednesday and a Saturday. So today's satsang is going to be brief because I think sometimes delivering too much information can confuse the point where we go from one thing to another, and it could be useful to just focus on one topic and keep it simple. So the topic, all topics have to tie back to this overall topic of happiness for the human being. And it's so important to understand that the happiness for the human being is to be found in a very particular form, and that is happiness through peace of mind. And peace of mind really means the absence of a certain type of thinking which manifests as a feeling, as an experience of oneself. So peace of mind is the absence of the uncomfortableness with oneself. And that uncomfortableness with oneself is a very specific type of thinking that we can call suffering. And that suffering manifests in 5 general forms: guilt, blame, pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. And so when that type of thinking that is at the base of the different forms of suffering starts to be eroded, we find that there is a quietness of the thinking mind. And that then means life continues to be there in terms of the circumstance. However, this narrative, this chatter, this commentary about what life means to me or why it should be different, blaming the other, feeling guilt, worrying, this noise is absent. And with the absence of that noise, an uncomfortableness with being in life is absent, an uncomfortableness with oneself ultimately falls away. And the suggestion here is that that is when the meaning of life is revealed, when we experience life free of suffering. Then there's no question about what is the meaning, where will it be found, what will I need in the future in order for there to be meaning, because it becomes obvious, the whole meaning of life is to be able to be in life comfortable with oneself, comfortable with life. And the opposite is when there is a psychological resistance to life. And that psychological resistance exists when there is a particular psychological identity in place, meaning a relationship to life, an idea about life that expects it or thinks it should be different. So, peace of mind, happiness for the human being, which is what these talks are about, is available in a very specific form, the absence of suffering, or what we can call peace of mind. Suffering is a specific type of thinking, and that suffering needs to come to an end. How does it come to an end? It comes to an end when the system that is designed to be able to have a certain narrative no longer is capable of having that same narrative. So that means it comes to an end when the system changes. And in very simplistic terms, the system changes when it becomes clear that the the view, the relationship to life within the narrative is out of line with how life actually works. So when the system realizes actually it doesn't make sense to look at the past and imagine it or want it or look at it as if it could have and should have been different. So while suffering, you know, you should have been in a different position, I should have been in a different position, and we should have done things differently so that the present turns out differently. That makes sense based on how life is understood. And so that type of relationship to life, in this case I'm talking about this relationship to the past, that happens. And if we come to see the event differently, then the narrative that's saying, oh, it should have happened differently, I should have functioned differently, is a bit like, is seen to be a bit like looking at the stars and saying, well, you know, we really should move that star somewhere else. We don't have that because it's clear to us that that commentary about the stars being in different positions just doesn't make sense. And because it doesn't make sense, our system doesn't create that storyline. However, because of our experience in the present moment, an experience that says, oh, I have the capacity to function exactly the way that I want, meaning I am the controller of what happens in the moment, because that's how we experience the unfolding of life, then we look back at what happened in the past and say, well, that happened because I, as the controller, made it happen. And if I had controlled things differently, then it will have functioned, things would have unfolded differently, and I could have controlled things differently. So that's the attitude we have towards the past. And we think it makes sense, so we then say, oh, I should have done things differently, you should have done things differently. And what that does is it creates an uncomfortableness with the one that functioned a certain way, either oneself or the other. The good news is that that isn't the way life unfolds. Life doesn't unfold because there is a controller, and that controller is not who we are. So when we see that life doesn't follow that set of mechanics, the narrative that assumes that that is the mechanics. And with the falling away of that narrative, there's no problem, because the problem is contained in the narrative. The uncomfortableness is contained in the narrative. The uncomfortableness with oneself, because in the narrative, the idea is I didn't function well enough. So that means I am not good enough. I am not complete. I am not whole. And so there must be a sense, there is in that narrative a sense of uncomfortableness. That uncomfortableness and that storyline is the opposite of acceptance. It's non-acceptance, non-acceptance of what happened. It's non-acceptance because the narrative says, I don't accept it, it should be different. And acceptance is when the non-acceptance doesn't arise. And the non-acceptance doesn't arise when we look at something and we see it simply couldn't have been different. So I don't have a story about it that says it should have been different. So this means that what we need to see deeply, not believe, but see it for ourselves, is that whatever happens through each of us is the result of components and variables and factors that are way outside, way bigger than us. We are essentially, and our functioning is the output of a system that is in movement and started moving 13 billion years ago. And that whatever happens in this present moment is a result of everything that came before. Another complementary way that can tie into that, but basically essentially demonstrates that things can only unfold the way they unfold, is if we see that the instrument that is speaking, the instrument that is thinking, the instrument that is feeling, is a very complex biological instrument designed by life. So the sperm and the egg come together, it creates a blueprint. That blueprint grows into an organism. The organism is part of an environment that shapes it. And so essentially the human being, which is what we are in this moment, is unique and designed by life and continually changing in each moment. And it finds itself in an environment, in a situation, and there is what we call my speaking, my thinking, but really it is just happening. And the brain and the whole biological instrument is immensely complex. And all of the functions are based on everything of this complexity working together, trillions of neurons and cells working as a biological machine. And when mistakes happen, that's just because the machine is not perfect. The machine is not capable of interpreting everything perfectly and coming up with perfect solutions. It will produce a solution based on its capacities. And so we need, if a thinking about this happens, it happens because life has delivered a suggestion, has delivered a description about, well, life unfolds and is happening rather than me and you as separate independent entities that are controllers making it happen. It is happening. We are part of the happening. That's a suggestion. And if a contemplation about this happens, then that's not your doing, that's part of the happening. And then if you start looking at specifics, I'm talking in general terms, but if you start looking at specifics, if you look at the way you respond to an animal or a situation, a problem, and you see that, let's say, someone spoke aggressively to you and you snapped back at them. And then in hindsight, you say, I feel embarrassed about what I did, or I feel guilty, I should have done it differently. And then you think about it and say, well, actually, the snapping back was the response, which tells me that is the response given the very complex situation, given the complex structure of my makeup. And if it clicks, it's like, well, I could have a story about functioning differently, but that then ignores the fact that what functioned is a very complex instrument in a very complex environment, and that was a result of all of the complexity. And for the output to be different, the situation and the instrument would have needed to be different. So the output is a result of everything being exactly the way it is. And so if this clicks, then every time the thought arises, oh, you should have done it differently. I hate you for functioning that way and creating pain. Or I should have done it differently. I hate myself for functioning this way. Every time that thought comes up, guilt or blame, pride, look at what I did, look how great I am, if the outcome is, then we might say, no, that's not the basis on which life happens. Life happens according to God's will, according to this much bigger movement of life. So you can leave God out of it if you like and just call it life. A whole series of impersonal interactions, cause and effect, leading in each moment to this, to what is. That's how the understanding of non-doership goes deeper and deeper and deeper as we investigate our own life experience for ourselves, following the concepts that are descriptions. And if our attitude towards how life happens changes, then the narrative that arises has to change with it. The attitude that is in place in the majority of humans, simply because of the way we develop, is the attitude towards daily life, the attitude of personal doership and attachment to outcomes. Personal doership is the deeply ingrained belief that says, I am the controller of whatever I think, say, feel, and do. The other is the controller of whatever they think, feel, say, and do. The word that's often used is the doer. I am the doer, which really means I am the one that decides in each moment how I function. And this, when I talk about I, it's talking about a psychological I. There is no entity that the psychology, the thinking mind imagines. There is just the organism, and there is no intermediary controller. There is an organism functioning. So thinking is just an output of the organism. So the doer is this imagined intermediary entity that doesn't exist. And when the organism itself realizes that it is functioning and creating an idea of an intermediary that doesn't exist, that's when the organism starts to change and stops producing that attitude. So the current attitude that leads to suffering is the attitude of personal doership and attachment to outcome. Attachment to outcome is also an ingrained belief that says my happiness, my completeness is to be found in pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And so then there is a grasping, there is a seeking, there is a craving for pleasure, because pleasure is assumed to be my lifeblood. I need it in order to be complete. And the falling away of that attitude means that the relationship to pleasure and pain changes from being where my happiness is to be found to simply either pleasure or pain in the moment. And when the expectation, the movement that my happiness is to be found in the future winds back, we find, actually, maybe life was never about winning and getting and gaining. Maybe life is simply about being here and living the experience, whatever it happens to be, in a way where we understand that the purpose of life is to be here at peace with what is now. And to be here at peace means actually to be one with life, one with the present moment, where we find the human instrument and its thinking and this is known to be not something outside of life, but rather part and parcel of the experience. So when there isn't an attitude of doership and attachment to outcome, we essentially find ourselves part of the singular creation. And it is the attitude of doership and attachment that creates a psychological layer of resistance. And that resistance effectively creates a psychological separation. And that psychological separation means we're not in harmony, we're not one with life. The psychological separation has the effect of making us feel like we're butting up against life instead of going with the flow. So the absence of the attitude of doership and attachment to outcomes means acceptance. It means going with the flow. It means the recognition that I am always being lived.